Chris Alexander of the Saratoga Springs Public Library. I'm delighted to again be hosting this program, Secret Gardens Revealed, with the Soroptimists of Saratoga County. This program is being recorded in speaker view, and once the recording is uploaded to the library's YouTube channel later this week, I will share the video link with everyone who is registered. You're welcome to put your questions in chat, and they will be answered at the end. And at this point, I would like to introduce our moderators, Mary Caroline Powers and Barbara Lombardo of the Soroptimists International of Saratoga County. And they're going to talk about the Secret Gardens Tour and introduce the four gardeners actually, who will be speaking with us. Thank you. I'm turning it over to you, Mary Caroline, and yes, I'm turning it over to you, Mary Caroline and Barbara.
Thank you so much, Chris, and good evening to everyone. We're just so glad that you could join us for the second year of our partnership, that is Soroptimists partnership with the Saratoga Springs Public Library. Special thanks to Chris Alexander of the library for tending to all the arrangements and for lending us extraordinary technical talent. The Saratoga chapter of Soroptimists was formed in 1979, a part of a larger international professional women's service organization that last year marked its 100th anniversary. Soroptimist, a coined word, means best for women, and that captures the essence of what the organization does, creating access to ways that society and individuals can improve the lives of women and girls around the globe. For instance, the funds that we raised from last year's Secret Garden Tour and other activities helped the Saratoga Soroptimists support a vast array of projects, from a surgical recovery room in Ecuador to fresh wells in Ghana to new classrooms for bilingual education for women and children in Honduras and an outdoor cooking kitchen in Zimbabwe. Closer to home, we lend our time and our skills to the Hope and Power Project in partnership with Wellspring. It's meant to help victims of domestic violence move forward toward a more positive, financially independent life, free of abuse. Additionally, we help provide scholarships for women returning to college and girls just starting their college educations. And we sponsor the Dream It, Be It project. And it is meant for girls in surrounding communities to offer them the chance to see what they might want to become, and then get them to meet the women who offer examples of achievement in those fields. These are just a few of the ways that Soroptimists use the dollars raised from fundraising activities like the Secret Gardens Tour. In its 27th year, the tour will be held on Sunday, July 10th from 11 to 5 this year. All of the gardeners are very anxious to show you their gardens, and 4 of them are joining us this evening. They are Leslie Brennan, Joanna Garrison, and Dave and Carol Gaudette, here to describe their gardens, show you some wonderful photos of those gardens, and after their presentations, answer your questions about gardens and gardening and woodchucks, indeed. We ask that all questions be typed into the chat feature of the Zoom. Barbara, anything to add?
I think you covered everything. Let's move on.
Okay, so we're going to get started tonight by asking Leslie Brennan to describe and show us photos of her exceptionally beautiful garden on Waterview Drive near Lake Lonely. Leslie?
Well, Leslie, you need to unmute.
Am I better?
Yes.
Sorry. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Mary Caroline, for the kind introduction. It's a real privilege to be included in this year's tour, and more importantly, to be able to contribute to the Soroptimists' mission for empowering women. I'm excited to show folks the garden and talk a bit about how the garden and I have evolved over the last few years. I started gardening when I moved to Saratoga about 6 years ago, and while my previous experience was minimal, and minimal is code for none, the house and the property really inspired me. We were very lucky to inherit good bones. The prior owners had taken great care of the property and really invested in hardscapes such as rock walls and terraced beds. As I learned and started to put my own mark on the gardens, I took my cue from the style of the house. It was important to me that I created something that fit in with that style. As you can see, the house has sort of a traditional or an English kind of vibe. Gardening is tremendously creative outlet for me that I never knew I needed until I started getting my hands dirty. And I'm completely fascinated and driven by the ability for a garden to create an emotional connection with us or a response from us. Next slide. When you come to the garden in a few weeks' time, the first thing that you'll come to is the front courtyard. This is a formal entrance to the house, as well as the gardens through a small gate between house and garage. This area was a terrific starting point for a beginning gardener because you have very limited spaces, and so it's easy to learn and try out new things. Over time, this area has evolved to really more of a traditional cottage style garden with a focus on sort of lighter colors and traditional garden plantings like delphinium and foxglove, phlox, cosmos, etc. Next slide. Once you enter through the garden gate, you're at the entrance to the main garden, which features a swimming pool and tiered perennial beds. This area is bounded on the east by a small garden shed and a fountain on the west side. Next slide, please. This area is often overlooked by visitors because this is the area that's behind the shed and it borders the east side of the property. So taking advantage of that seclusion, we try to create a really quiet space with lots of green and a really very limited color palette. But achieving that Zen-like state was kind of a challenge because as you'll notice in the photograph, there's a lovely area full of pool equipment. Now, I know we all struggle with, what do we do when we have unsightly views or noise or things that we want to hide in a garden? So what we did in this case was two things. First, we helped minimize the sight and sound of the equipment. We replaced the pump with something that was a little bit smaller and more energy efficient. And then we started to grow those views that you see around it a little bit taller to really kind of hide the rest of that filter equipment. But in addition to that, we decided to create a new focal point to further draw your attention away from that. Next slide, please. This is, nope, sorry, back one. There you go. So what we did is we tucked a little bench in across the side there. You'll see it in the left-hand side of the photograph. And then across from that created a small planting area that has sort of visual things that get refreshed every season. So irises and lilies, ferns, they're underplanted with sedum and creeping thyme. And then behind all of that is sort of a wall of sweet autumn clematis that forms a really lovely backdrop. So all of these things combined really kind of make this into a quiet area where you don't notice, the pool equipment, et cetera, at all. So I was very happy with the outcome. Next slide, please. This is the west boundary in the main garden, and it is the complete opposite of the east side. Here, direct sun prevails, and I'm talking sun like full sun all day. So around this fountain, we've planted black cap ajuga with lavender, and then behind that, you'll see espaliered apple trees, which are super fun. It took me about 3 years to get around to learning how to care for these guys. And there was so much pruning by the time I did, but it was really a terrific learning experience. I found this great book called Pruning and Training by Christopher Brickell, and I'll pop that in the chat later for folks in case they're interested. That really kind of became my Bible on how to care for everything from apple trees to lilacs to rejuvenating rhododendrons. And the thing that I really loved about the book is it made those sorts of activities accessible because oftentimes I think folks are afraid to really, what will happen if I prune this or what if I prune this incorrectly? And so the sort of the step-by-step instructions in there really help you give you confidence and help you learn about how to care better for your plants. In this photo, you can tell this was taken last year when we had all that rain and apparently the lilac, completely lost its mind. Next slide, please. So this is back in the main garden. Next to the courtyard, as a gardener, this is really where I learned the most. Sorry, things flipping out here. And the reason it was is because it's really got good scale to be able to really test out things, test out colors, to understand how elevation might affect how you see a plant or a flower, or how do colors work out over time during a season. One of the things that I first did, it was the first spring I was here when I was really learning things, and someone had encouraged me to do this, is I dug up everything and I put it in pots. And then that allowed me to kind of rearrange it to see how I liked it and whether it worked in one spot versus another. And to this day, I still use that as a strategy to understand how I want to put plants together. But the best part about this kind of area, and I'm sure everyone has them in their garden, is the area to really kind of experiment and learn and figure out how those plants might work together. Next slide, please. So the first beds in this garden I refer to as my impulse buy beds, because they're generally filled with whatever I absolutely could not pass up at the nursery that year, which tends to be, unfortunately for my husband, quite a few things. I put some sense into these gardens. There are some perennial plantings, but by and large, there's not a lot of regimen. There's not a lot of design or control. While nearly all the other beds are really sort of designed to create a specific effect, I didn't do that here. And the reason I didn't do that is because this bed reminds me why I loved gardening to begin with, right? That exuberance, that art of the possible, that oh my God, I need one of everything sort of feeling. I don't ever want to lose that. I don't want to lose the things that made me love gardening in the first place. And none of us should, regardless of whatever else someone thinks of our gardens. Next slide, please. This is the second tier beds in that garden. And here you'll start to see some sense in the beds. These are sort of old school English beds, if you will. They're filled with roses and delphinium and foxglove and dianthus. I started with roses because someone told me don't go with roses. They're too hard. They're kind of a pain. And so I immediately, bought 20. My poor husband had to dig the holes. He joked more than once that he was digging his own grave, which we all know is completely ridiculous because I'm sure it would have been bad for the roses if I did that. All the roses here are David Austin roses. Here you see Boscabel, Lady of Shalott, and Brother Caterpillar. Next slide, please. This slide is of the twin bed to the other, and this is really just a shout out for companion plants. You can learn all kinds of things about companion plants online. The internet is chock full of advice, but what I would really encourage you to do is to visit other gardens. There's really nothing that compares with being able to see the plants in person and understand how they relate together. What's the color look like? What does the height look like? And what are the growing conditions like? Oftentimes, I can't tell you how many times I bought companion plants that were not really for the same conditions the plant I was actually putting it next to. So going out and visiting gardens and talking to gardeners about why they made the choices they did will teach you so much. And it really is just a joyful thing to do. Next slide, please. At the top of the main garden, obelisks with climbing roses and clematis mark the entrance to the fire pit and woodland edge garden. This is a great location to hang out at the end of the day with a fire in the summertime, but it's also just as fun in the fall when the leaves are coming down. And the area serves as a transition point from more formal gardens to more natural and relaxed areas. The fire pit is surrounded by flowering quince and hydrangea trees to give it a little bit of privacy, and then it backs up against the edge of the woodland area. Next slide, please. So developing the woodland area was actually kind of difficult for me. And it took about 2 years to finally come up with sort of the right design. And I think it was because originally the area was just this big continuous area. I kept moving plants around, but everything felt off. It was just sort of like everything was mushed together. The solution, it turned out, was to find a way to divide up that area into more manageable chunks. So what we did is we added 2 sort of flagstone paths that allowed us to kind of divide that up and create a sense of purpose for each area. Most of the trees and shrubs were chosen so that as they mature, the destination of any of the paths are sort of hidden and add an element of discovery in there. One thing I did want to point out in this one, you'll notice with a flagstone, there's a ground cover next to that. This ground cover is called Mazus reptans or cup flower. This is a terrific ground cover for shade or part shade, which is always sort of tough to find things for. It grows like crazy. You're looking at here, this was brand new planting. So this is only after about 2 months. I'll pop that in the chat as well in case anyone is interested. It does a lovely purple or a white flower in the springtime. And the nice thing that I like about it is it smothers weeds, but it's also very easy to control. It gets a little vigorous, but you could just slice it back with a soil knife very easily. Next slide, please. For each path that I created, I added a plant as a focal point, which I think is really fun because you can find a plant that's really special, very different, that allows you to kind of create a lovely focused feeling along the path. Here I chose a Ruby Falls Redbud. In the springtime, she's surrounded by forget-me-nots around her trunk. In the summertime, I like to use mass plantings of low annuals to add color and really highlight the tree. Next slide, please. Thanks. This is the second stone path. It kind of cuts across the woodland area. It's lined with turtlehead and hosta, salvia, astilbe, other sort of woodland plants that you can use. They're sort of right on the edge of shade, but sun. The bend in the path is marked with a red dragon dwarf Japanese maple. This is underplanted right now with dwarf hosta. This photo was taken a little bit earlier this year, but I have now added cut flower in between those paths stones as well, so that it sort of mimics what we saw on the other side. Next slide, please. And this last, we have the newest addition, the stream garden. This area has really been the most fulfilling one to create. I have to admit, don't tell the other areas of the garden I'm playing favorites. And the reason it was is because we started with a completely blank slate. This area was the very back of the property. It slopes down towards a former creek bed and really hadn't been developed, primarily shaded. And I was very intent on keeping the natural feel back there. And I wanted to create a space that felt sort of hidden and that gave you a sense of discovery as you kind of worked your way back toward it. In addition to being really relaxing, it's a tremendous chance to add alpines or other plants that can survive in dry shade. Unlike other areas of the property, this area of the garden has no irrigation system other than getting water in there to establish the plants. From then on, they're on their own. But it's just definitely one of the most fun areas that I've done so far. So I know I kind of went through this quickly. I want to give a lot of time for my fellow gardeners. So this is my last slide for this evening. And I just wanted to say thanks for letting me share the garden with you. Building these gardens has been such a gift. It's a tremendous creative outlet and has led me to meet wonderful gardeners who have shared their insights and ideas and have inspired me in ways that I never imagined. And I can't wait to see everyone in July.
Leslie, thank you so much. It's an exceptional garden, and that she's built it in 5 to 6 years is an extraordinary accomplishment, at least from my viewpoint. It is now time to move on to Joanna Garrison, who is the creator and the caretaker of a most unusual garden on Bryan Street in Saratoga Springs. Joanna?
Thank you very much. I'm going to dig right in. Thank you for allowing me to be a participant in this as well. And Mary Caroline, I know native gardens may seem unusual, but we're hoping and aspiring to make that more usual in the very near future. So in 2014, my husband and I were lucky enough to raise my former house here on Bryan Street and build a solar geothermal ICF house. And in doing that, I had a blank canvas and I had maybe 5 plants from my former garden, which I had always been very much a hodgepodge gardener. I'd gone out, found something pretty and thrown it in and not really given much, and not given any other thought to it. And a local landscaper came over one time and did a consultation with me. And, she said, "Oh, Joe, you have Queen of the Prairie here. That's native." And I said, "Well, what do you mean by native?" And she said, "Well, these plants evolved here. They want to be here, and they require less water, less maintenance, and they're larval host plants." And I said, "Well, what do you mean by a larval host plant?" And here we have the iconic, many of you probably recognize, this is the Monarch Caterpillar, or Monarch Cat as we call it. This is right outside my front porch. And this Monarch Caterpillar, probably in its 5th instar before it's about to weave its chrysalis and become a beautiful Monarch Butterfly. I dove in, I really plummeted down that rabbit hole of the whole native plant species larval. I wanted to learn as much as possible. And a couple of years later, maybe a lot of you have also read about this insect apocalypse, which again sounds a bit like her hyperbole, but really it isn't. If we lose insects, that help us sustain life. Insects, 90% of vegetarian insects need a specific plant to survive. And if a plant is not pollinated, it dies. And therefore, when we lose integral pieces of our food web, that become extinct and are never able to be produced again, it impacts us gravely, biologically, ecologically. So I learned about the larval host plant, and Doug Tallamy, who is a renowned entomologist and professor of biology in Maryland, he is just a household term these days, Doug Tallamy. I'll throw his name in chat as well. One pair of chickadees, we all love birds, right? One pair of chickadees needs between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to raise one clutch of babies. And I thought that must have been a typo when I first read it, but it is true. See any interview with Doug Tallamy, read it. It's online, it's readily available. And I also learned that, you know, we grow up and we see in cartoons when we're young, right? And we see a bird pulling a worm up from the soil and we think, well, birds feed their young worms. Robins do, and woodcocks, and very few species of bird feed their young worms. They need caterpillars. And if we don't have these plants, we're not producing the caterpillars, we're not feeding birds, we're not feeding every other species on our planet. So this beautiful cat becomes, next slide, please, a monarch butterfly. And this monarch is on aromatic aster in this beautiful, beautiful plant. Aster is one of the largest flowering families in the world. Monarchs need nectaring plants. They're very important in the fall before their migration down to Mexico. Next slide, please. And this lovely photo taken by my husband is on New York Ironweed. And this is also a late summer, very popular nectaring plant, grows about 6, sometimes 7 feet tall. Hummingbirds like it, bees, butterflies, and the monarch, as you can see as well. Next slide. And this is Sheldon. I named him. This is Sheldon feeding on fennel. And fennel, dill, and parsley are very important for the swallowtails. This beautiful caterpillar becomes, next slide. Sheldon became a beautiful black swallowtail butterfly a couple of weeks later. And Sheldon, now maybe it's Sheldona. I am not very good at telling the difference between the male and females. On the monarch I can, on the swallowtails I have trouble. And this is on purple coneflower, Echinacea purpurea, and very easy low maintenance plant to grow. Next slide. And this gorgeous photo, I love this close up. This is a great spangled fritillary. And fritillaries are also part of the Lepidoptera family as well, butterflies and skippers. And the great spangled fritillary is feeding on nectaring on Joe Pyeweed, another very easy plant as well that butterflies and bees adore. And the host plant for the fritillary, believe it or not, is the beautiful common blue violet that many people, I mean, at least years ago, would rip out of their lawn and say, oh, you know, this plant, I'm sick of it, you know, being in spots, and they'd rip it out. And this is what it produces if you leave that beautiful violet. Next slide. Now the skippers are a very important pollinating family as well. There are thousands of different skippers. This is the broken northern dash, or northern broken dash. And this is on oregano. And if you're not sure where to start with herbs, because they're really easy. Many of the herbs we grow are, you know, from Europe. They're not native to here. Many are, but these aren't. But pollinators really do love herbs. Next slide, please. Now, the bumble, the common eastern bumblebee, she's flying up to, they're the worker bees. She's flying up to Senna hebecarpa. And this shrub I just absolutely love. And I learned about 5-6 years ago when I was growing tomatoes, we grow a lot of vegetables as well here, that bumblebees and sweat bees, the Halictidae family, they do something called buzz pollination or sonication, and they literally shake their bodies. They are the original belly dancers and twerkers, and they shake the pollen from the flower onto their bodies. And as you can see in this photo, bumblebees have something called pollen baskets or corbicula on their legs, and you will see the pollen, the color on in their basket actually resembles the color of the pollen from the flower from which they're taking it. So honeybees, you know, they're European and they're very important as well in agriculture, but they are not a native pollinator, and they cannot pollinate tomatoes and blueberries and a lot of other lovely flowers and vegetables and fruits that we eat. Next slide. And this family, this is a leaf cutter bee, and a very important bee as well. I didn't include the photo, but one time I caught, look at that pollen butt, just the cutest little thing. This is on pink swamp milkweed, another really easy one that proliferates readily. The swamp milkweed does. Also a host plant, of course, to the monarch, being a milkweed plant. And the leaf cutter mama cuts out these beautiful, perfect circles with her mandibles, with her teeth, and flies it. And I one time caught it on my button bush shrub, and I didn't get video of it, but I saw mom like flying back to her ground nesting cavity, which leads me to the point of a very important principle of wildlife gardening is, you know, insects need ground. They don't want perfect turf lawn. So, you know, I know we worry about, we want everything to look nice and tidy and neat, but gardening is just like life, is messy and unpredictable, and you don't have to worry about it, because at the end of the day, the insects and the birds and every other creature and wildlife will appreciate your lack of efforts, and you're not being lazy, you're being intentional. Next slide. Oh, and I love this this guy. So this is not a bee. This is a narrow-headed marsh fly from the Syrphidae family, or hoverfly or flower fly, they're called. They are such essential pollinators. Flies, studies have shown, can pollinate at higher altitudes, at cooler temperatures than many bees can. And I bet nobody here likes chocolate, right? Nobody likes chocolate. Well, bees don't pollinate chocolate, flies do. A very tiny fly by the name of a midge is able to get into the tiny little petal, the flower of the chocolate plant, the cacao plant, and pollinate it. And I was blown away by that as well. So thank a fly the next time you have some chocolate. And the next slide. This beautiful specimen as well. This is a syrphid fly, marginalis. I forget the Latin name sometimes, but flies have one pair of wings and bees have two. And every day I just discovered a new bee robber fly just the other day. They are phenomenal in their mimicking abilities. And as you can see, it reminds me of like a Greek amphora, his abdomen. I just absolutely love this. This is on a calendula annual, which is very easy to grow. Next slide. And this wasp gets such a bad name. If any of you have heard of Heather Holm, she has written some phenomenal books on native plants and pollinators, and this gorgeous tome called Wasps. She's anyway, you can check her out. I'll throw her name in the chat as well. But this wasp, come on, look at how cute she is. This is a great golden digger. Now, we always think of bumblebees as being like little teddy bears in flight, and we love our hummingbirds, but once you get used to great golden diggers, my husband's used to them now, people come over on the mountain mint. I have 4 kinds of mountain mint. They are the pollinator disco of plant. Everything loves them. And the great golden diggers never, ever, ever bother me. They are solitary wasps. 90% of wasps are solitary. They need ground cavity, and they are not like paper wasps or hornets or yellow jackets that are social wasps, and of course build a hive and need to protect that hive and become very territorial and very aggressive. These are not. They're wonderful and very important pollinators as well. Next slide. We love our hummingbird moss, the sphinx or the clearwing moss. This is a Hemeris thisbe, excuse me, I almost said Diphinus, on the pink swamp milkweed as well. And the next slide, please, leads us to the hummingbird, the ruby-throated hummingbird. This is Jack on purple coneflower again. This is a couple of days before he passed away in our garden. And hopefully from old age and not from drinking a dirty hummingbird feeder, because that nectar needs to be changed. If you do put this out for your hummingbirds, it needs to be cleaned and changed every 3 days or so. But they only live 3 to 5 years, and they are important pollinators as well. And their favorite plant on our property, next slide, is where I buried Jack, at the base of our Lanceleaf sempervirens, the coral or trumpet honeysuckle, not the japonica, the Japanese one, but the native one. And this is probably one of the most tropical looking plant that I have and it grows up. We've created a wall to give us some privacy from the neighbors growing up our deck. We have a Dutchman pipe on the other side, and I absolutely love this. Bees like it as well, longer tongued bees and the hummingbirds. Next slide. And this great, this is the Camouflage Looper. So the video is super cool. One time, this is on a Lanceleaf Coreopsis, another very easy full sun native to grow that pollinators love. And I call him the fashionista of the invertebrate world, because as you can see, I thought the flower was moving when I first discovered it about 4 or 5 summers ago. And what they do is they take bits of petal and they camouflage against predators, of course. And you see this, like, it looks like a flower part moving, and they are just awesome to watch go up and down the stem very slowly and hang out there waiting for something to consume. Next slide. Dragonflies and damselflies, a very intricate and essential part of wildlife gardening as well. They love mosquitoes, as many of you probably know. They consume between 30 and 100 mosquitoes every day. And I love being out in the evening and watching them buzz around. You know, you don't need to be by the river. You see a lot of them, of course, near water. We have dozens of them. It's wonderful. Next slide. And this lovely creature I discovered the end of April. I was carefully weeding the nefarious bishop's weed, the gout weed, which drives me nuts, but I was lifting, which leads me to my next very important point about wildlife gardening is, you know, I leave leaves in the fall and I cut back in the spring, and I lifted some leaves aside. And I was, you know, carefully, and all of a sudden I see this and I went, wait a second, I know this is important. And as you can see in the bottom left corner, there's a milkweed seed there. And there's an interesting connection between fireflies, I've learned, and milkweed. So yet another reason to grow milkweed. But this is a firefly larva in a nice plump one. Next. So another component is that I am definitely no designer. I am not Leslie Brennan in no way, shape, or form. She's an extraordinary designer. But, you know, in a few years, and we're adding a little bit every more, you know, native gardening does not have to be messy. And if you take a look, a lot of, I know, you know, Doug Tallamy, again, he advises a 70-30 ratio. So if you have 70% natives and 30% non-natives, like I have a lilac tree, I love my peonies, you know, I grow Tithonia Mexican sunflower, and I love zinnias and Lisianthus, and, you know, we love our peonies or cosmos sometimes as well. But native gardening does not have to be just sloppy, but if it is, that's okay too. Because at the end of the day, the insects and the birds and the wildlife don't care. So is that my last? Oh, okay, last slide. So what was a very messy construction site in 2014, and my first bed went in 2015 in the front. This was in July of 2020. As you can see, I have a Xerces pollinator habitat sign that my husband put up in the back. I also have one in the front. This isn't like you can certify your property. I probably will do that through the National Wildlife Federation pretty soon. But as you can see, you know, you also don't need to spend a lot of money, because I will share seeds and people share seeds and plants. And, you know, that cold frame that we have lettuces growing in right now in bok choy, my husband built for $20. You know, people are always getting rid of things and recycling. So anyway, the wildlife gardening, you know, it's just like a dream come true for me. I absolutely love it. It's one of the best things I've ever done in my life. And, you know, I hope, you know, to inspire more people to follow this path as well, because I know you'll love it as well.
Joanna, thank you so much. Your photos were exceptional. Thank you for sharing them. And now it's time to go to Nelson Avenue and the garden that Dave and Carol Gaudette have created. From the street side, it looks somewhat unassuming, but then you open the gate and a Disneyland awaits you. Carol, Dave, it's all yours.
Well, thank you. That's very, very kind of you to say. And thank you and Barbara for putting this slideshow together. Those were 2 hard acts to follow. But we can't wait for you to see our garden when hopefully you all come on the tour. One thing you asked us to talk about was our philosophy. And I had to think long and hard about it. And we talked about it. And winters here are so long and we cannot wait to get outside. So our philosophy is basically we want to spend as much time outdoors as possible. So we've kind of turned our backyard into our house for the summer, and we spend every possible moment out there. So as Mary Caroline said, we kind of like to surprise people because our house is just unassuming. I think that's a great word. And people expect it to be a postage size stamp yard. And so our neighbor across the street, who's new from England, came over the other day and he gave us exactly the reaction we hope you have. So he opened the gate and he didn't expect what he saw. And he said, "Blimey." And that made us very happy. Dave's going to share his philosophy about gardening.
Sure. Well, many years ago, my grandfather got me interested in gardening when I was 4 or 5 years old. And it seems to skip generations because my father wasn't terribly interested and my son wasn't terribly interested. But now my grandson, who's 5, seems to be pretty interested in gardening. He runs out into the backyard whenever he comes over to check on his plants that he's planted. And so it's become a nice family thing.
Next slide.
One more thing about my philosophy, though. I liked what Joanna said about hodgepodge gardening, or that she started out perhaps as a hodgepodge gardener. I kind of feel that I am somewhat that. I don't do a whole lot of planning and sketches and drawings and all that, but I do it for just general enjoyment.
So just before you get to that fence leading up into it, we have a fire pit area, and this is surrounding the fire pit. And this is what I really garden. I love how Joanna said a good place to start is with herbs. So I have all kinds of herbs, which is outside of our kitchen. So it's easily accessible to me, but it's also an easy thing to maintain.
In the back, there's some honeysuckle, red, and or rather kind of a yellow and a pinkish color, which they tend to get quite crazy, and you have to almost have a machete to keep them tamed down.
Yeah, in this picture, they're not blooming, but they are rather eye-catching. Next slide. So this is the area leading up to that fence, the gate that goes through. And this is the house I grew up in. And the patio is original to the house. It was built in 1935. But this is an area we kind of have divided our backyard into rooms. So this fire pit area we tend to use in the fall because it's easy to flick on the gas flame and kind of gather with friends around there. And by that part of the year, our pool is closed, and so we spend more time here. Also, Dave has created these amazing succulents.
Yeah, you can just barely see one of the planters on the far right. They've been in the garden now for about 5 years, but obviously we have to take them in the fall, and they keep getting larger and larger. So you'll see those when you come to visit.
Next slide, please. Okay, so this is our pool area, which we've divided into rooms. You can't quite see in this slide, the path leading up to this pool is full of hostas that we got from Shades of Green in Charlton, and we have probably 20 different varieties, and we don't have them all named, unfortunately. And Dave built this pergola, which he's going to talk about.
Right, and creeping up the pergola, we have some red trumpet vines, a couple of them, and I'm anxious to see how far they'll go this season. Some people say that they don't recommend growing them because they can get or be invasive and be kind of bullies in the garden. But I think we can keep them under control if we keep at them. But this is one iteration of what our garden looks like, but this year it's different.
Yeah, and I think our other part of our philosophy is it's ever evolving. Every year our garden looks different.
Yeah, and that's partly because we rely a lot on annuals. I was always heavy into annuals. I had my own greenhouse at one point, so it was easy and inexpensive to grow all our own plants, which we did. I grew over 100 flats of plants, so we had thousands and thousands of things. Now that I have to purchase them, we think about the actual plantings a little more carefully, but it's still a little bit random sometimes.
Next slide. Okay, we do love, probably our favorite plant for an annual are New Guinea impatiens, and we always stick with this red and white theme. It looks a little bit different. This is a slide from last year where we divided up. This year we interspersed them, and we always have this area in the corner where we have the New Guinea impatiens.
And with the annuals, I just love the intensity of the color that they bring to the garden, which enables you to enjoy the color year round, season round, rather than just a few weeks with the perennials. Although I really do admire a nice perennial garden.
I loved how Leslie talked about a focal point, a plant that she really loved in each part of her garden. I don't know if you could see it so well, but to the left of the slide, they almost look like lollipops, but these are double knockout rows. They're trees, and it looks like they're on a stick. And I think these are our focal point there, and certainly Dave's favorite plant. So much so that every year he digs them up because they don't winter well, and he buries them in our raised beds out in the back. Next slide, please.
So our gardens, I think, are a real peaceful and relaxing oasis. So we do a lot of entertaining, and it gives us great pleasure in being able to relax outside with our friends and family.
Yeah, one of the things we like to do from this vantage, you can't quite see, is we have a drop-down screen. And so we have movie nights in the summer, and we have the plants backlit, and then we sit out and watch a movie surrounded by plants. Next slide.
Here's a picture of a flowering dogwood. I had ordered 3 dogwoods that were supposed to be pink, and you'll see there's a little bit of pink, but I'm a little disappointed in them because they're a little blush, but they're quite beautiful, and the actual blooms are very large for dogwoods. And one thing that most people probably know is that these are not flower petals, but they're actually bracts, which are kind of like sepals, but they're, in the case of the dogwood, very colorful.
And surprisingly, these stay in bloom most of the summer. We expected they'd just be there for a few weeks, but they last a long time. Next slide. So as I talked about having rooms, when you come, you'll see there's kind of a lounge area, then we have a dining area, we have a kitchen area, then we have a living room area. And the one thing that was missing was a bed area. So we have a day bed now that is in the spot where we used to have our greenhouse. And we love sometimes falling asleep out there at night surrounded by plants. We don't usually make it the whole night, but it's a nice start to the evening.
That, and I'm thinking it'd be a good place to guard against the groundhog problem that I've had lately.
Next slide.
Well, here we have the raised vegetable beds, and I did this about 5-6 years ago. And there's a lot of advantages to having raised beds. You can see the clutches on in the back on the left, and those extend our season, the growing season, somewhat. I actually had the lettuce that you see in the foreground growing in March, and through snowstorm and whatnot. The garlic on the right was planted last year, or the year before, actually, the season before. And this is probably a picture taken in mid-April.
Yeah, so we do get overrun with zucchini. So when you come, if we have a lot of zucchini, if you ever stop by, we'll just make you leave with a zucchini because we have so many. Yeah, it's a lot of produce for 2 people. So we will gladly share with you. Next slide.
This is a little more mature
Probably
picture.
what it will look like when you come.
Yeah, there's so many advantages to having raised beds, as most of you, I'm sure know. One is that they help keep the soil warm or warm it up a little sooner in the spring. And it also allows for more individualized soil augmentation so that each bed can have its own particular mix for whatever vegetable you plan on growing. And it's also easy to ID for plant rotation. I keep a notebook, and every year we rotate the types of plants that we have in each bed so that no plant is grown where it has been grown in the last at least 3 or 4 years. And probably the obvious thing is you don't have to crawl around on your hands and knees to work the garden. I have a little chair that I can sit at and pretend I'm an old guy.
Next slide. As we said, every year our garden's a little different, and sometimes it's a surprise to us. And this is a surprise from last year. We have these sunflowers that self-seed, and this just cropped up, and we're never sure.
I planted the sunflowers purposefully about 4 years ago, and they just pop up ever since then, wherever they feel like it. And I just don't have the heart to pull them out or move them, so they just kind of grow where they grow. And this is just an example of one of about 4 that we had last year.
Next slide. So this is my favorite area of the garden. It's to the east, no, north, to the north of our property. And it's our memorial garden. We had 2 golden retrievers that were cremated. And so we have their remains buried out here. And this is our tribute to them. And this is my favorite peaceful part of the garden. And this year, that's not in the picture, we added some benches and a bird bath that the birds just really migrate to. And it's been a pleasure to watch them. So we can't wait to have you all come to our garden. And I know Mary Caroline and Barbara are going to tell us more about how you can get tickets to attend the show. So thank you.
Okay, thank you both so very much. It really is kind of a Disneyland environment back there. You're surprised by one thing and you turn and you're surprised doubly by the next thing. It's a wonderful garden to be in. Thank you for sharing it. Before we get to the questions, and we do have lots of good ones, we want, and remember to type your questions into the chat function. We want to remind people about how to get tickets for the garden tour now that you've had a little taste of it. And so Barbara's going to review that for us. Barb?
All right, thanks. So I don't know if you can see it. This is what the ticket looks like. The ticket also serves as the program, and the descriptions of all the gardens and suggested driving directions are included in that. You can buy tickets now in 2 ways. You can go online at seroptimustsaratoga.org, where you can, for the first time, also print out this program when you buy your ticket. Or you can go in person to Northshire Bookstore on Broadway in Saratoga Springs, at any of Cudney's 4 retail locations, and at Fadigan's Nursery in Latham. Now, on the day of the tour, while supplies last, you can buy a ticket in front of the Visitor Center across from Congress Park between 10:30 and 1 p.m. Tickets are $25 in advance and $30 on the day of the tour. Our last slide in the presentation is going to have our website address, so you can find all of this information and more.
Terrific. Now let's get to the questions. Some of the questions may be directed at one of the specific panelists. Others are more general, and all of you should feel free to jump in. Barb?
Our first question will be from the first person who posted a question, Harriet, who says that she's a novice gardener and is trying to figure out how to get started in planting the gardens. You each touched a little bit about how you personally started on it, but why don't we start? I don't, Leslie, do you want to just pipe in and recap a bit about how to start a garden if you don't know what you're doing? You'll need to unmute. Thank you.
There you go. How to start a garden if you don't have anything going. I think I would start with probably a small area. Divide it up. Don't try to tackle your whole yard. Maybe pick an area that you see often or that is contained enough where you can, kind of trial out some things and plantings is probably where I would start. That's what I did, is I just picked small areas and started experimenting there. There's tons of folks out who will give you advice on sort of base plantings if you want to put in shrubs or trees, as well as perennials or annuals, and really kind of help you come up with a plan for how you want to attack it. But definitely don't try to do your whole yard at once. You'll lose your mind.
I was going to add that for me, the most important thing was sunlight. If you want vegetables, you have to have a lot of sunlight. You can have a shade garden if you want, but they would probably not include vegetables. And the quality and depth of your soil is important. You might have to augment your soil. So those are some considerations as well.
Yeah, I was going to say that as well. Soil is key. And actually, the Cornell Cooperative Extension, if you bring a little bag, if you say you plot out an area, even like a little 6x6 area, you can get it tested. And it used to be $1. I don't know if you still know at the farmer's market where they have a booth sometimes, but they're in Bolson Spa, and you get an email and it lists, itemizes everything, the components in your soil. So I would make sure, soil is one, light and water requirements, and as Dave said, if you want to grow some veggies, there's something called foodscaping I like to do as well. Maybe, Dave obviously and Carol have a phenomenal veggie garden, but I just planted kales in with some of my perennials and a lot of herbs, and flowers and vegetables and herbs just do beautifully together. Again, they're all getting pollinated. They're attracting those pollinators, and they benefit from each other.
Joanna, we have a question for you from Mary Jennings.
Hi, Mary.
What about making friends with what are called so-called weeds?
Okay,
Keep
so
these in your garden. You don't know what they are. You don't know. Do I keep it? Do I pull it?
So a famous expression I found on the tea bag, right, is the difference between a flower and a weed is a judgment. And many important weeds, so-called weeds like milkweed and sneezeweed, and they're very beneficial. But then we have the bishop's weed, the gout weed, which drives me bonkers, which I'm always pulling out. They call it like the North Broadway disease as well. It's terrible. It's such an invasive. So Mary, last year I was tempted to pull something out, and I actually asked my friend, maybe Jackie Donnelly. She is a native guru in the area. She has a blog. She's phenomenal. And she said to me, she gave me the advice, said, you know what, wait and see what it is, because if something flowers, then that can, like the garlic mustard that I'm also battling, I try to pull, because if it flowers, those seeds will spread and you're doomed. You're spending a lot more time weeding. But I would wait and see what it is if you're not sure, or take a photo if you can. And I use iNaturalist. It's an app on my phone, or iNat as they call it. There are many, many wonderful apps if you use that. Or just ask somebody who's a little more knowledgeable. But that's what I usually do. I typically wait. I try to identify it if I can. And if not, I wait to see what it is. And try to ID it again. And then if it's an invasive, then it's gone. I yank it.
Okay.
Oh, we've got some other questions. One, Dave, specifically for you. Obviously, you're growing several different kinds of lettuces. Which ones do you have the most success with?
Well, I grow several because they have different maturation dates. So one of the very fastest, although it's not truly, I guess, a lettuce, is arugula. And Carol loves arugula, so that's nice. There's a Bib lettuce that I like. and some of the red leaf lettuces are nice. So I grow it mostly based on its maturation date that's printed on the seed packet.
Good idea. Here's a question for Chris, from Chris. We have a shady area next to the side street. She wants to plant ground cover close to the street, but is worried about salt from plows in the wintertime. Any suggestions?
Shady, you said.
Um,
Hmm.
It's a shady area next to the spot that's exposed to the street
Um,
on the side, yeah. We've stumped the gardeners.
I am, you know what, check into, there's one, it's, oh dear, I'm thinking of the Latin word. But it's called barren, it's a native, it's barren strawberry. And typically that it's an evergreen as well. So it flowers these beautiful little yellow flowers in the spring. It is not one of your invasives. Like another thing I'm yanking out in my woodland bed is the invasive strawberry that like the wild strawberries, you know, those hard ones that have no flavor, they're actually invasive. But barren strawberry is lovely. I know it's part shade or shade. Or part shade or sun, excuse me, and it's an evergreen, so it looks pretty even after it flowers. That might be one. It's very hardy. The dogs pee on it in my alley all the time, and it still most of the time comes back. The neighbors' dogs. And another, check into wild ginger as well. That is a shady one. I'm not sure how it would do with salt, but wild ginger is beautiful. And yes, it is edible. You can pick it and eat it when it blooms in the spring.
I have a quick question for all three gardeners. To mulch or not to mulch? That is my question.
Mulch with compost.
And should it be the compost from out in Washington County?
I've had good luck with Booth's Blend,
Yeah.
which is actually in Greenwich, but I would not mulch with anything other than compost. I went on that road and it's destructive to the garden. It's destructive to your lawn. If it somehow gets blown onto the lawn, wherever it lands, your grass will not grow. So, and plant things so that you don't ever have to mulch again.
I'm with Leslie. There's something, pardon me. We call it now green mulch. A friend of mine that is always shocked. He's like, you need to mulch. And I said, well, too much mulch for one, over like a half inch of the traditional mulch. Insects, again, I keep, they can't get under the mulch and they can't really, live in that area. And I know mulch is wonderful. It is beneficial because it helps retain moisture and it's important. And who the heck wants to be out there weeding 24/7? No, we don't want to. But it's called green mulch now. Like Leslie was saying, I am actually going and trying to get more and more part shade or shade, that will be, again, that layered story. And I'm just trying to let those native ground cover act as green mulch, and it's healthy and it provides habitat.
I love how gardeners help gardeners. And we also heard from one of our participants, Kathy, was suggesting to Chris Vinca minor periwinkle.
That's an invasive. Sorry, I'm sorry. That is like that. Yeah,
So
myrtle.
it survives the salt, or it's myrtle is better.
Okay.
We can do better. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, Kathy. Thank you, though.
I'm sorry, Kathy. I don't mean to. Yeah, yeah.
Let's take one more question, I guess. And if anybody has a last minute one to type in, go ahead, Mary.
We have one about something you're seeing more and more of, the use of grasses as a design feature or in a garden as background. This writer said they look very unnatural in the Northeast, she thought. Any thoughts about the use of grasses in your gardens?
This is Leslie. I don't find them as as jarring or thinking that they look unnatural. And that comes from someone who I would have shared that opinion probably about 3 years ago and said, I'm never putting grasses anywhere. Used in the right situations, you really can naturalize those grasses so they look quite beautiful. They're wonderful to be able to use to create more privacy screens, etc. The only thing that's a little bit tough with grasses is that most grasses are working with them irritates your skin. So you really need to wear long sleeves and gloves if you're ever, weeding in them or trimming them, etc.
Okay, good
Here,
advice.
Could I add something about grasses?
Sure.
So grasses are actually a very vital component of wildlife gardening as well. I just started using them. Like I had switchgrass. I actually just planted a few grasses, a little blue stem yesterday. And they actually provide overwintering habitat for eggs and pupae and caterpillars. And, I again, learning design, kind of learn as I go. The sedges as well are very important. I have sedge out in the front, and it's extremely drought tolerant. I don't do a thing. I kind of forget about my beautiful bed. I forget about it after it's bloomed, but they're actually very important for pollinators as well.
Great, okay. Dave, any thoughts on grasses?
Well, I've just this year planted a few groups of grasses, but in the past I haven't really done much with them. But I think they can be very beautiful and ornamental. So I'm giving it a shot. So
Wonderful.
everybody who comes to visit this year can give their opinion.
Okay, well, we certainly have unanimous opinion from all of you. I'm afraid we're out of time, unfortunately. This has been a wonderful, really rich discussion. We want to thank especially all the audience participants who joined us this evening, and certainly special thanks to our panelists, Leslie Brennan, Joanna Garrison, and Dave and Carol Gaudette for their offering of knowledge and insight about gardening, and they are inviting all of you to come see their gardens in person on July 10th. And again, many thanks to Chris Alexander for her extraordinary help in arranging the panel discussion, and to my co-host, Barbara Lombardo. Any parting thoughts?
This has been a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to the tour. Hope to see a lot of you there.
On Sunday, July 10th. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks to the panelists. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
See you on the tour.